So there are a few things. There are a few things to talk about in this chapter. One, leaving the bodies unburied. Um, that is a sign in most cultures of great disrespect. At least in the Judeo-Christian cultures. And I guess in Islam as well, it's very important to bury the dead and to bury the dead properly. And it was often left that people who died sinfully or died who were bad people were left to just rot on the outside or rot wherever they were. And there was a common punishment in medieval times, common even up until probably the 1900s, or late 1800s. There was something that was called gibbeting, where if somebody was executed for a crime, their body was put on display. So it was, they had special cages made in medieval times. They had these special cages, metal cages, and you just put the body in there and it just sits in the cage, and the birds and the animals and whatever get at it. And it was done to say, okay, this is this person, this is the crime they committed, this is what happens if you do it. So gibbeting was a popular way of deterring people from committing crimes. Back in the Bible, it was considered very bad to hang somebody from a tree, and it was considered a shameful thing. It was considered shameful to them. It was considered shameful to the land. And there are stories. There's one story about, I think it was Saul's daughter, who stood over his body for like a year, keeping the animals away until the king relented and said, okay, you can bury him. And then finally she buried him and everything was good. But there were cases like that where it's like, okay, we are going to take the person and we are going to hang them. And we are going to leave them up as an example to others. And as I said, it's a sign of shame to them, but the Bible claims that that's a sign of shame to the land. That it is a curse upon the land that you leave a body hanging out like that. And really, at the point when somebody's dead, you might as well just forgive them. No matter what they did, it's like, okay, they're dead. Fine, whatever. They're dead. They're not going to cause any more problems. They're not going to do whatever. And, there's no reason being angry with someone who's dead. Let's see. The next thing. Yes, the mob. So here you had the mob, essentially a lynch mob going around doing the hangings. And the boss and the king were there. And the boss is like, we got to get away from this. Because when you have a large, angry crowd of people, they tend not to be too particular about who's a friend and who's not a friend. So if you see a large group of angry people, get away. Do not be around that. No matter how good the cause is, once you start getting into the violence, no good is going to come from being there that night. I have a friend who gave advice to his son, which was, nothing good ever happens after 2 a.m. So, it's like, okay, you may want to stay out, but just bad things happen late at night when people aren't thinking. And when people are in groups that are large and angry. There is a book that you will probably read in high school called Lord of the Flies. And Lord of the Flies is one of these classic books that is... It's a classic book. It was written in the 40s or 50s, something like that. And it's about a bunch of young boys who end up on an island without supervision. So it's just a bunch of teenage boys all together. And in one of the early chapters, there's a party. And it's not explicitly mentioned, it's not explicitly described, but you kind of get the idea that they killed one of them that one of the boys who was there was killed as part of the celebration of everybody yelling, everybody screaming, everybody. It was in celebration of a successful hunt. And so they had their spears and they were yelling and chanting and stabbing. And then the person markedly disappears. It's like he's mentioned and mentioned and mentioned, and then all of a sudden nothing. And then he's mentioned towards the end of the book. It's like so and so at the party, and everybody was like, huh? Mobs do things like that, and mobs will end up killing people who they don't intend to kill. They will end up hurting people who they don't intend to hurt. And when one mob meets another mob, everybody's going to get hurt. So large angry groups, especially late at night, stay away. Just go, hide, knit, do something safe. There's also one of the things that he touches on is there's a lot of social pressure and things like this, where everybody is going to punish the person who's different, the person who's out, because they are afraid of being the next person who's different and the next person who's out. And this actually ends up causing things like this. Because if you're to take a look at the riot here, there was a family and a couple of people with them. And so there's like 5 or 6 people who were accused of killing the Baron. But there were 18 people who ended up hung. So, do the math on that one. There were people who were hung who probably had no connection. They're like, hey, this person isn't yelling loud enough. And societies that get mob rule, where the voice of the people, where the voice of the people is louder than the voice of law, where louder than the voice of reason, where emotions run the day, will tend to devolve into things like this. I've said it before. The French Revolution is one of the prime examples of this, where you had the revolutionaries, and the revolutionaries, their first goal was they were going to tear down the monarchy. So they tore down the monarchy, and they tore down the nobles, and they executed them. And they were like the shopkeepers, the bourgeois, the people who, run the shops and the artisans. They weren't backing us hard enough against the nobility. They're next. Hey, wait a minute. The priests. They weren't backing us hard enough against the shopkeepers. They're next. Hey, we're starving. Robespierre, he led us to this. He's next. And Robespierre was the guy who started it all. So you had this whole thing in the French Revolution where they were just like killing anybody in authority, even if it was their own leaders. And I mean, it was terrible. It was called the Reign of Terror. And this went on and on and on until Napoleon just came in and is like, okay, I'm Napoleon. I have an army. Because he rounded up anybody he could find with a uniform. He said, okay, you're in my army now. And they're like, okay, we're in your army now. And there were mobs. It's like, okay, cannons. I'm in charge now. So, I mean, it was the French Revolution and the bloodshed from it only really ended when Napoleon laid down the law, where Napoleon decided he was going to be an absolute monarch and he was just going to kill everybody who got in his way. And that was it. There was no turning on Napoleon because Napoleon had the order. Napoleon had people who saw that he was not going to be turning on them, that he was clearly the one in charge. And so it's like all of the people who were like under Napoleon, yes, they were afraid to turn on him because, he would string them up, he would guillotine them, he would take care of them in some way. But at the same time, At the same time, they knew that as long as they didn't do anything really bad, they were okay. And things got quickly better under Napoleon. So stay away from mobs. Just don't get involved in anything like that. Look for plays to emotion. If people are trying to make you feel, this is going to sound terrible. If people are trying to make you feel angry, if people are trying to make you feel scared, do not trust those emotions. Think. Thinking is the important thing. And that is what I think of chapter 30.